Hello, everyone. It's a great honor to serve as a speaker for the lecture series at the Complutense University in Madrid. I'd like to thank Professor Asun Lopez Varela for her kind invitation. My name is Xiaojie Wang, and I'm Associate Professor of Chinese and Comparative Literature at Rutgers University in the United States of America. Today, I'd like to share with you on the topic nature, landscape, and modern Chinese poetry. In recent decades, there has been growing interest in sustainable development. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, adopted by all United Nations member states in 2015, provides a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for people on the planet now and into the future. At its heart are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which are an urgent call for action by all countries, developed and developing, in a global partnership. The Goal 15 seeks to protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of torrential ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation and halt biodiversity loss. At the Rio 20 conference, member states reaffirmed through paragraphs 197 to 204 of the outcome document, The Future We Want, that intrinsic value of biological diversity, as well as the ecological, genetic, social, economic, scientific, educational, cultural, recreational, and aesthetic values of biological diversity and its critical role in maintaining ecosystems that provide essential services, which are critical foundations for sustainable development and human well-being. In modern times, our ecosystems and landscape have been increasingly domesticated. Human intervention of the nature is pervasive and profound. How to configure the relationship between nature and human, landscape and human societies. How to preserve and develop sustainable landscape. These are compelling and imperative questions for our sustainable development. In today's lecture, I'd like to discuss three main issues. First, landscape ecology and sustainability. Second, the notions of nature and landscape in modern Chinese literature. And third, landscape in modern Chinese poetry. The environmental movement that started in the 1960s sought to promote theory and practice that facilitate the integration of human and nature. In the article by Linehan and Ross, Back to the Future, Back to Basis, the social ecology of landscapes and future of landscape planning, they argue that we must also reassert vision, value, and ethic, account for the relationship among the physical, cultural, economic, and political dimensions of space, and finally, better incorporate the knowledges, perceptions, and practices that exist between the places we study and the people and communities who call them home. The scholar Laura Musacho discussed 6 elements of landscape sustainability. In her 2009 article, The Scientific Basis for the Design of Landscape Sustainability, she introduced a conceptual framework about the 6 E's of landscape sustainability: environment, economy, equity, aesthetics, ethics, and human experience. She discussed the interrelatedness, contradictions, and limitations of the conceptual framework in relation to human health and human security, ecosystem service, biodiversity, and resource management. Sustainability, a widely recognized common goal for humanity, has become an increasingly significant topic in the study of landscape design and planning. For instance, this is the main goal of Simon Bell and D. Apostol's 2008 book entitled Designing Sustainable Forest Landscapes. The book explores issues including ecosystem regeneration, the management of natural forests, and the design and management of forest landscapes. The scholars Wu Jianguo and Chen Xiangqiao considered the tradition and the present practice and theories of Chinese garden culture and landscape design. In their efforts to integrate landscape ecology and landscape architecture, they studied several principles and models of Chinese garden and landscape design and argued the ancient Chinese philosophy of unity of man with nature and its associated design principles can provide useful guidelines for this integration as well as for the development of a sustainable landscape architecture. In a published article entitled Sustainable Landscape Architecture, Implications of the Chinese Philosophy of Unity of Man with Nature and Beyond, they have presented this amazing chart to show the interrelatedness of unity of man with nature philosophy with traditional Chinese landscape architecture, ecological design and planning, as well as sustainable landscape architecture. Nature and human being, the cosmos and human society have been at the center of Chinese philosophy and literature. How is the landscape conceived and represented in literature? How is the aesthetic, the environmental, the human experiences of the landscape constructed and intersected in literary experiences, particularly in poetry? In the second part of my lecture, I'd like to explore these questions and ask how Chinese writers of the modern age took efforts to conceptualize a new poetics of landscape in a dialectic reflection on Chinese tradition and European intellectual resources. I will examine modern Chinese poetry's engagement with the poetics of landscape and how it mediates and meditates on the relationship between human beings and things, poetry and nature, physical and metaphysical worlds. First, let's take a look at a few Chinese renditions of the German writer Goethe's 1780 poem, Ein Gleiches oder Wintersnachtlied 2. Über allen Gipfel ist Ruhe, in allen Wipfeln spürst du kaum einen Hauch. Die Vögelein schweigen im Walde, warte nur, balde ruhest du auch. This poem describes a night on the top of the hill with the poet alone in the woods when birds, the wind, and trees all quiet down. It is a very popular verse among Chinese readers, and it has over a dozen versions of Chinese translations since the 1920s. This is not surprising. Some reasons to consider. It is because of the lyrical beauty of the poem, and also the poem conveys the harmony between man and nature, which evokes the same aesthetic beauty as classical Chinese nature poetry. The classical Chinese poetry is well known for its great achievement of nature poems, which emerged as a distinctive genre during the period of the Six Dynasties around 200. Together with landscape painting, it is a prevalent genre throughout the trajectory of Chinese literature. Here, for instance, we have a poem by the Tang Dynasty poet Wang Wei, Deer Enclosure. It was translated into English by Pauline Yu. Empty mountain, no man is seen. Only heard are echoes of men's talk. Reflected light enters the deep wood and shines again on blue-green moss. More importantly, the practice of translating and interpreting Goethe's poem stimulates new understandings of nature and the poetics of landscape in modern Chinese poetry. I will focus on the conceptualization of nature and landscape by two major modern poets, Liang Zongdai and Feng Zhi. First, let's look at Liang and Feng's rendition of Goethe's poem. On the left-hand side of the slide, we can see Liang Zongdai's Chinese translation of Goethe's poem, 流浪者之夜歌. And on the right-hand side is a translation done by Feng Zhi. So for Liang Zongdai, the poem conveys a notion of harmonious unity between man and nature. The trees, the mountain, the birds, and human coexisted in peace, hence constituting not only a distinct cosmos outlook, but also an organic relationship between human beings and nature. Liang Zongdai is a Chinese protege of Paul Valéry and the best practitioner of symbolism in modern Chinese poetry. In Goethe's Wanderers Nachtlied 2, Liang observed a pure form of poetry that is free of objective references to scenes, narrative, reasoning, and sentiments. Because it constitutes a distinctive cosmic outlook, Liang calls it 宇宙观的是 cosmic poetry. As he pointed out, this landscape here is not the landscape in classical Chinese poetry that is always an affective and subjective projection of the poet itself. Therefore, the classical Chinese concept, the fusion of feeling and scene. Liang noted, in classical nature poetry, it is less about the real landscape or nature than about the qing, the subjective feelings and senses of the poet, which are aroused or stimulated by an imaginary landscape. But Goethe's landscape is self-sufficient, unaffected by the poetic subject. Human beings and natural objects together constitute the landscape. What reveals here in Goethe's holistic worldview, his perception of the interrelatedness and relativity of all phenomena, which was formed along the line of the philosopher Leibniz. The particular is a monad, a complete expression of the universe. Beauty is defined as unity in diversity. As Goethe observed, I quote, the universal and the particular coincide. The particular is the universal appearing under different conditions, unquote. In Liang Zongdai's thesis entitled Li Bai and Goethe, he argues that by observing the cosmic world, the poetic self discovers and mediates the world spirit or the cosmic spirit. He observes that their cosmic spirit resides in their conception and perception of nature. Here is a key passage from this essay when he asserts, roughly in English translation here, Goethe in particular uses the most accurate observation to support the most accurate intuition, the most serene reasoning to control the most enthusiastic emotions. When facing the natural world, from the sun, the moon, and the stars, down to the grass and trees, he demonstrates diligent and perceptive ways of representation. When conceptualizing the nature, he relies on intellectual resources, including Rousseau and Kant, and tracing back to the flawless philosophical system of Spinoza and Leibniz. Therefore, he can see wholeness in the fragments, perfection in imperfection, harmony in contradiction. In other words, all things are only one to him, and all that had vanished is only a symbol of eternity. Now, Let's move on to look at Feng Zhi's translation and reading of Goethe's poem. Feng Zhi was not only one of the most prominent modernist poets in 20th century China, but he was also a significant German literature scholar who studied and translated Novalis, Hölderlin, Goethe, and Rilke, among others. Feng studied German literature at Peking University before going to Germany to pursue his doctoral research. From 1930 to 1935, he studied at Heidelberg University and University of Berlin, respectively, and completed his dissertation on Novalis with Karl Jaspers as one of his advisors. After returning to China, Feng worked as a German literature professor at various universities while continuing his poetic creation. What we see here in the slide is a picture of Feng Zhi in the 1930s and also the book cover of his well-received poetry collection, Sonnets, which actually won him the Internationales Kunstpreis in 1987. The book itself was published in 1941. Feng Zhi's readings of this poem reveals a new concept of landscape. In this cosmic unity, from hills to trees, from birds to human, animate and inanimate beings are brought together in an interconnected relationship in evening silence. Human beings are not positioned at the center of the nexus of meanings and associations. Rather, as Elizabeth Wilkinson pointed out, human is embraced within nature as the last link in the organic scale of being. What's also important is the intersection of the objectivity of the observer and the subjectivity of the wanderer who quested for inner peace. So the non-intervention of human in the natural world and the merge of the objectivity and the subjectivity of the poet, these two major stances are manifested in Feng Zhi's own literary work of the 1940s. Here, I'd also like to note Feng Zhi's interpretation of Rilke's notion of the landscape art. In 1932, Feng Zhi translated Rilke's 1902 article entitled Von der Landschaft. It's Rilke's preface to his book Volkswede. In 1899, the painter Fritz Mackensen established an artist colony at Volkswede near the northern German city of Bremen. Mackensen was soon joined by other painters, including Hans am Ende, Fritz Overbeck, and Otto Modersohn, among others. On Christmas Day, 1899, Rilke visited the Volkswede colony and was infatuated with the flat North German landscape. Rilke's literary response to Volkswede was a monograph composed of 5 chapters, each dedicated to one of the artists, with an introductory article on the formation of landscape painting in European history. The preface was eventually not included in the book Volkswede and published posthumously in 1932. The same year, shortly after its publication in Germany, Feng Zhi translated this article into Chinese. And it had profound impact on his own notion of landscape. What strikes him is particularly the relationship between men and things in nature. Feng Zhi noted, human is no longer a balancing partner among his fellows, nor is he who, for his sake, there existed morning and evening, near and far. Human is like a thing in all things, infinitely alone, and the union of all things in human retreats to the common core, which is the root of all living beings. Feng Zhi's notion of the interconnectedness of human beings and things, spirit and nature, in the spirit and natural world can be traced back to his 1930s dissertation at Heidelberg University, entitled Die Analogie von Natur und Geist als Stilprinzip in Novalis Dichtung. In this dissertation, Feng Zhi observed that in Novalis' work, the meaning of things doesn't stand in the things as such, but in the relationship among things. As Novalis states, the landscape appears at the inner vision of the poetic self. This interconnectedness between human and nature is at the center of Feng Zhi's poems created in the 1940s during the Second Sino-Japanese War. In this slide, we can see two key notions from Novalis' work, Heinrich von Auf der Dinge. Jene Fernen sind mir so nah und die reiche Landschaft ist mir wie eine innere Fantasie. The landscape appears as an interior vision of the poetic self. Here, I'd like to share with you an example of Feng Zhi's own poems, the number 16 in his collection of sonnet, in which he described this interrelatedness of human beings and all things in nature. 我们站立在高高的山巅，化身为一望无边的远景，化成面前的广漠的平原，化成平原上交错的溪径。哪条路、哪道水没有关联？哪阵风、哪片云没有呼应？我们走过的城市、山川都化成了我们的生命。Here are just the first two stanzas of this sonnet, and we can see here a wonderful English translation of this poem. As he writes, our growth, our sorrow, are a pine tree on a certain hill, a thick fog over a certain town. We blow with the wind, flow with the water, and are transformed into the crisscrossing road on the plain, into the lives of the travelers on the path. What's so interesting in this poem is not only the interrelatedness between the path, the river, the wind, and the cloud, but also the interconnectedness and mutual forces of influence and transformation between human nature and human experiences. We transformed into landscape, cities and mountains transformed into our lives. Just like Novalis noted, every single object, be it animate or inanimate, could be the beginning in an endless loop. For landscape to be established, nature as a scene needs to be restored in its original shape and independent from human interventions, be this intervention in the form of history or of culture. Feng Zhi stated in the postscript to his 1940 prose collection, 山水, or the landscape. What I described in this slim volume are not the so-called well-known sceneries. The real wonder of the nature is in the ordinary plane, the figure of a tree, the growth of a blade of grass, the flight of a bird, all contains an infinite, eternal form of beauty. In the same article, he further observed, we should restore the original shape of landscape and stop mingling it with human traces. Only so will the nature erect in front of us. At the same time, we'll feel how we should develop. 这里自然藏在我们面前处理起来，我们同时也会感到我们应该怎样生长。It doesn't suggest that there existed a nature that is completely separate from human traces in history. What he proposes here is a new perspective of viewing landscape without placing human beings at its center. As a new observing subject is established, there erects the landscape. In this slide, to create and conceptualize landscape, it is crucial to envision a new way of seeing the world and revealing a new meaning of human existence. Let's look at Feng Zhi's notion of a new observing subject. The landscape can only be established through the perception, mediation, and representation of a poetic subject or the poet. Feng's notion of the interiority and the perception of landscape anticipates what the Japanese scholar Karatani conceptualizes as the discovery of landscape in his book, Origins of Modern Japanese Literature. In this foundational work, Karatani considers landscape as an epistemological constellation, the origins of which were suppressed as soon as it was produced. According to Karatani, landscape can only be discovered by the inner self, an introspective subject. The landscape emerged when the observer comes to realize the interconnectedness of human beings and nature, but also Feng talks about a new mode of observation, which facilitates the change and exchange between the observer and the observed. Here we see clear inference of Goethe on Fengzhi, especially Goethe's Metamorphosenlehre. Goethe's far-reaching scientific activities began in 1777 when he was put in charge of the Ilmenau mines near Weimar. Around the same time, Goethe brought a decade of investigation to his observation field Italian journey of 1786 to 1788. His research in geology, botany, morphology, physiology, and optics intensified through the 1790s and was maintained until his death. In September 1944, Fengzhi delivered a talk in Kunming entitled The Automaton in Faust on Goethe's nature philosophy. He discussed Goethe's approach to natural science, in particular, his notion of seeing. The human being knows himself only insofar as he knows the world. He perceives the world only in himself and himself only in the world. Every new object opens up a new organ of perception in us. What strikes Fengzhi is the interactive and transformative relationship between the observer and the observed, which points to Goethe's notion of zarte Empirie. Goethe's notion of delicate, tender empiricism emphasizes the role of perception, intuition, and inspiration in science. Goethe's approach to science offers an alternative to Descartes or Newton's modes, which, according to Goethe, caused humanity's alienation from the natural world. Let's take as an example the following passage from Fengzhi's essay, A Vanished Mountain Village, collected in Shanshui landscape. Here, his depiction of landscape demonstrates this new mode of observation to see the transfiguration between the observed and the observer. I'm not going to read the entire passage for you. For those who are interested, I would strongly encourage you to finish it. 这中间高高耸立起来，那植物界里最高的树木，尤加利树。We watch it grow every moment, as if our body, our surroundings, and even the whole mountain are growing with it. This passage defines the relationship between human beings and natural objects, but more importantly, the viewing subject. The modern viewing subject finds the eucalyptus tree in the landscape, and the shape of the tree is not fixed, but is constantly growing. The poetic subject is also transformed by observing the tree and grows along with it. This mutual growth and communication is endless and cannot be compromised or stopped. Here, in this passage, we could even read it as a verbal visualization of the Volkswede painter Otto Modersohn's 1892 landscape painting, Falkenberg. To conclude today's lecture, I'd like to share with you the final poem in Fengzhi's 1941 collection, Sonnets. I will leave it as a quote for you to further reflect on the relationship between nature, landscape, human society, the sustainable landscape, and art creation. Here we have the English translation of the sonnet number 24, published in 1941. Particularly, I'd like you to note the final two stanzas. We have listened to the whole night of winds and watched a whole day of yellow grasses and red leaves. All in vain. Where shall we dispose of our ideas? I hope that these poems hold like a banner certain things that cannot be held. This poem ponders a few key questions. If the vitality of the cosmos lies in its eternal change, and if artwork is also situated in the same perpetual flow of time, how could it take a definite form? How could it become sustainable? How could it make meanings and be communicable to the readers of various generations? Thank you so much for your attention. And here is a page of articles and books that I referred to in my talk. Thank you.